This is Storytime with Livilu and guest. Each episode, Livilu invites a friend to read a story to her. Sometimes the story is going to be sad, sometimes it's going to be funny, but most often the story is going to have an important lesson for Livilu and you too. So listen carefully and enjoy today's story with Livilu.
Hi, Livilu.
Hi, Byron.
How are you?
I am great. Thanks for coming to read me a story.
That's great. I love reading stories.
I love listening to stories.
And this is one of my favorites, The Christmas Miracle of Jonathon Toomey. Yeah. Susan Wojchiechowski wrote it.
Okay.
And P.J. Lynch did all the pictures.
All right.
And in this story, there's a guy in there that's kind of grouchy.
Oh, dear.
And see if you can figure out maybe why he was so grouchy in the story.
Okay.
The village children called him Mr. Gloomy.
Gloomy?
But in fact, his name was Toomey.
Toomey.
Mr. Jonathon Toomey. And though it's not kind to call people names,
No.
this one fit quite well. For Jonathon Toomey seldom smiled and never laughed.
Oh.
He went about mumbling and grumbling, muttering and sputtering, grumping and griping. He complained that the church bells rang too often, that the birds sang too shrilly, and that children played too loudly.
Uh-oh. He does sound gloomy.
Yes. Mr. Toomey was a wood carver. Some said he was the best wood carver in the whole valley. He spent his days sitting at the workbench carving beautiful shapes from blocks of pine and hickory and chestnut wood. After supper, he sat in a straight-backed chair near the fireplace, smoking his pipe and staring into the flames. Jonathon Toomey wasn't an old man, but if you saw him, you might think he was. The way he walked bent forward with his head down. You wouldn't notice his eyes, the clear blue of an August sky. And you wouldn't see the dimple on his chin, since his face was mostly hidden under a shaggy, untrimmed beard speckled with sawdust, wood shavings, and, depending on what he ate that day, with crumbs of bread or a bit of potato or dried gravy.
Oh.
The village people didn't know it, but there was a reason for his gloom, a reason for his grumbling, a reason why he walked hunched over as if carrying a great weight on his shoulders. Some years earlier, when Jonathon Toomey was young and full of life and full of love, his wife and baby became sick.
Oh, no.
And because those days there were before hospitals and medicines and skilled doctors, his wife and baby died. Only 3 days apart from each other. Yeah.
Byron, this story is sad.
It is a sad one to start. So Jonathon Toomey had packed all his belongings into a wagon and traveled till his tears stopped. He settled into a tiny house at the edge of a village to do his wood carving. One day in early December, there was a knock at Jonathon's door. Mumbling and grumbling, he went to answer it. There stood a woman and a young boy. "I'm the widow McDowell. I'm new in your village. This is my son Thomas," the woman said. "I'm 7, and I know how to whistle," said Thomas. "Whistling is pish-posh,"
Pish-posh,
said the woodcarver gruffly. "I need something carved," said the woman. And she told Jonathon about a very special Christmas figures her grandfather had carved for her when she was a girl. "After I moved here, I discovered that they were lost. she explained. I had hoped that by some miracle I would find them again, but it hasn't happened.
Oh.
There's no such thing as miracles, the woodcarver told her. Now, could you describe the figures for me? There were sheep, she told him. 2 of them with curly wool, added Thomas. Yes, 2, said the widow, and a cow, an angel, Mary and Joseph, the baby Jesus, and the wise men. 3 of them, added Thomas. Will you take the job? Asked Widow McDowell. I will. I'm grateful. How soon can you have them ready? They will be ready when they are ready, he said. But I must have them by Christmas. They mean very much to me. I can't remember a Christmas without them. Christmas is pish-posh,
Pish-posh.
said Jonathan gruffly, and he shut the door.
He is a real gloomy guy.
He is. The following week, there was a knock at the woodcarver's door. Muttering and sputtering, he went to answer it. There stood the widow McDowell and Thomas. Excuse me, said the widow, but Thomas has been begging to come and watch you work. He says he wants to be a woodcarver when he grows up and would like to watch you since you are the best in the valley. I'll be quiet. You won't even know I'm here. Please, please, piped in Thomas.
7-year-olds really can't be quiet.
It's hard.
It's hard.
With a grumble, the woodcarver stepped aside to let them in. He pointed to a stool near his workbench. No talking.
Oh,
No
okay.
jiggling.
What?
No noise.
I
warned Thomas.
can't do that.
The widow McDowell handed Mr. Toomey a warm loaf of cornbread as a token of thanks. Then she took out her knitting and sat down in a rocking chair in the far corner of the cottage. Not there, bellowed the woodcarver. No one sits in that chair. So she moved to the straight back chair by the fire. Thomas sat very still. Once, when he needed to sneeze, he pressed a finger under his nose to hold it back. Once, when he desperately wanted to scratch a leg, he counted to 20 to keep his mind off the itch. After a very long time, Thomas cleared his throat and whispered, Mr. Toomey, can I ask a question? The woodcarver glared at Thomas, then shrugged his shoulders and grunted. Thomas decided it meant yes, so he went on. Is that my sheep you're carving? The woodcarver nodded and grunted again. After another very long time, Thomas whispered, Mr. Toomey, excuse me, but you're carving my sheep wrong.
Oh.
The widow McDowell's knitting needle stopped clicking. Jonathan Toomey's knife stopped carving. Thomas went on. It's a beautiful sheep, nice and curly. But my sheep looked happy.
Happy?
That's pish-posh,
Pish-posh.
said Mr. Toomey. Sheep are sheep. They cannot be happy.
No. Silly.
Mine did, answered Thomas. They knew they were with the baby Jesus, so they were happy. After that, Thomas sat quiet for the rest of the afternoon.
Yeah, he better.
When the church bells chimed at 6 o'clock, Mr. Toomey grumbled under his breath about the awful noise. The widow McDowell said it was time to leave. Thomas sneezed 3 times.
Achoo, achoo, achoo.
Then thanked the woodcarver for allowing him to watch. That evening, after a supper of cornbread, he sat down and boiled potatoes. The woodcarver sat down at his bench, picked up the knife, he picked up the sheep, and he worked until his eyelids drooped shut. few days later, there was a knock at the woodcarver's door. Griping and grumbling, he went to answer it. There stood the widow and her son. "May I watch again? I will be quiet," said Thomas. He settled himself on the stool very quietly, while his mother laid a basket of sweet-smelling raisin buns on the table.
Yummy.
"The teapot is warm," said Mr. Toomey said gruffly, his head bent over his work. While Mr. Toomey carved, the widow McDowell poured tea. She touched the woodcarver gently on the shoulder and placed a cup of tea and a bun next to him. He pretended not to notice, but soon both the plate and the cup were empty.
Yummy.
Thomas tried to eat the bun his mother had given him as quietly as he could, but it's almost impossible to be 7 and eat a warm, sticky raisin bun without making various smacking and lip-syncing and satisfying noises. That's right. When Thomas had finished, he tried to sit quietly. Once he almost hiccuped, but he took a deep breath and held it till his face turned red. And once, without thinking, he began to swing his legs, but a glare from Mr. Toomey stopped him, and he kept them so still that he fell asleep.
Uh-oh.
After a very long time, Thomas whispered, "Mr. Toomey, may I ask a question?
Uh-oh.
Is that my cow you're carving?" Nodded and a grunt. After a very long time went by, then Thomas cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, but I must tell you something. That is a beautiful cow, the most beautiful cow I've ever seen. But it's not right.
Uh-oh.
My cow looked proud."
Proud cow.
"That's pish-posh,"
Pish-posh.
growled the woodcarver. "Cows are cows. They cannot look proud. My cow did. He knew that Jesus chose to be born in its barn, so it was proud."
Okay.
Thomas was quiet for the rest of the afternoon. The only sounds that could be heard were the scraping of carving knife, the humming of the widow McDowell, and the click, click, click of her knitting needles. When the church bells chimed at 6 o'clock, Mr. Toomey muttered under his breath about the noise. The widow McDowell said it was time to leave. Thomas shook first one leg, then the other. He thanked the woodcarver for allowing him to watch. That evening, after a supper of boiled potatoes and raisin buns, the woodcarver sat down at his bench. He picked up his carving knife. He picked up his cow, and he worked until his eyelids drooped shut.
Until his eyelids drooped shut.
Yes. A few days later, there was a knock at the woodcarver's door. He smoothed down his hair as he went to answer it. At the door were the widow and her son. "May I watch again?" asked Thomas. As Mrs. McDowell warmed the tea and put a plate of fresh molasses cookies on the workbench, Thomas watched the woodcarver work on the figure of an angel. After a very long time, Thomas spoke. "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, is that my angel you're carving?"
Uh-oh.
"Yes, and would you do me the favor of telling me exactly what I'm doing wrong?"
Oh.
"Well, my angel looked like one of God's most important angels, because he was sent to baby Jesus." "And just how does one make an angel look important?"
Good
asked the
question.
woodcarver. "You'll be able to do it," said Thomas. "You're the best woodcarver in the valley." After another very long time, Thomas spoke. "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, may I ask a question? "Do you ever stop talking?" asked the
Uh-oh.
woodcarver. "My mother says I don't. She says I could learn about the virtue of silence from you."
Uh-oh.
Under his beard, the woodcarver's face turned pink. The widow McDowell's face turned as red as the scarf she was
I
knitting.
bet she was embarrassed.
"Well, speak up. What's your question?" "Will you please teach me to carve?"
Cool.
"I'm a very busy man," grumbled the woodcarver. But he put down the important angel. "You will carve a bird."
A bird.
"A robin, I hope," said Thomas. "I like robins."
Yeah, me too.
With a piece of charcoal, the woodcarver sketched a robin on a piece of brown paper. He handed Thomas a small block of pine and a knife. He showed him how to lop the corners off the block and slowly smooth the edges of the wood into curves. Thomas copied the woodcarver's strokes, head bent, tongue working from side to side of his lower lip as he concentrated. Then, when the church bells chimed 6 o'clock, Jonathon Toomey was holding Thomas's hand in his, guiding the knife along the edge of a wing. He didn't hear them ringing. The widow McDowell said, Thomas brushed the wood shavings from his shirt. Then he reached out and brushed 2 especially large pieces of wood shaving from Mr. Jonathon Toomey's beard. He thanked the woodcarver for teaching him how to carve. Later, after a supper of boiled potatoes and molasses cookies, Jonathon Toomey went to his workbench. He thought for a long time. He sketched drawing after drawing. Finally, picking up his carving knife and picking up the angel, he carved until his eyelids drooped
Shut. I bet they take that.
A few days later, there was a knock on the woodcarver's door. Mr. Toomey jumped up to answer it. There stood the widow McDowell with a bouquet of pine boughs and holly sprigs dotted with berries. And there stood Thomas, clutching his partly carved robin. While Thomas and Mr. Toomey carved, Mrs. McDowell put the bouquet in a jar of water. She scrubbed Mr. Toomey's kitchen table and set the jar in the center on a pretty cloth embroidered with lilies of the valley and daisies, which she had found in a drawer below the cupboard. "Next I will carve the wise men and Joseph," the woodcarver said to Thomas. "Perhaps, before I begin, you will tell me about all the mistakes I am going to make."
Oh.
"Well," said Thomas, "my wise men were wearing their most wonderful robes because they were going to visit Jesus. And my Joseph was leaning over baby Jesus like he was protecting him. He looked very serious."
Very serious.
It wasn't until the church bells had chimed and the widow and her son were preparing to go that Mr. Toomey saw the jar of pine boughs and the scrubbed table and the cloth embroidered with lilies of the valley and daisies. "I found the cloth in the drawer. I thought it would look pretty on the table," the widow McDowell said, smiling. "Never open that drawer,"
Oh.
the woodcarver said harshly. When the two had left, Jonathon put the cloth away. That evening, after a supper of boiled potatoes, the woodcarver worked on Joseph and the wise men until his eyelids drooped
shut.
A few days later, there was a knock on the woodcarver's door. He dusted the crumbs from his beard. He brushed the sawdust from his shirt. At the door were the widow McDowell and Thomas. All afternoon, Thomas watched the woodcarver work. When it was time to leave, Jonathon said to Thomas, I am about to begin the last two figures, Mary and the baby.
Yeah.
Can you tell me how your figures looked? They were the most special of all, said
Most
Thomas.
special.
Jesus was smiling and reaching up to his mother. And Mary looked like she loved him very much.
Very much.
Thank you, Thomas, said the woodcarver. Tomorrow is Christmas. Is there any chance the figures will be ready? The widow McDowell asked. They will be ready when they are ready.
When they are ready.
I understand, said the widow, and she handed Jonathan 2 packages. Merry Christmas, she said.
Merry Christmas.
Jonathan folded his arms across his chest. I want no presents, he said harshly. That's exactly why we're giving them to you.
Yeah.
She
Cheer
set
'em
them
up.
down on the table and left. Jonathan sat down at the table. Slowly he opened the first package. Inside was a red scarf, hand knit, warm and bright.
That's fun.
He tied the scarf around his neck. The other package held a robin, crudely carved of pine.
Oh, he gave his robin to him.
Yeah, a smile twitched at the corner of Jonathan's mouth as he ran his fingers over the lopsided wings. He dusted the fireplace mantel with his sleeve and placed the robin exactly in the center so he could look at it from his chair.
Well,
The woodcarver did not eat supper that day. Instead, he began to sketch the final figures, Mary and Jesus. He drew Mary, then wadded the sketch into a ball and tossed it on the floor. He drew the baby, wadded the sketch into a ball and tossed it on the floor with the first.
uh-oh,
He sketched again.
uh-oh.
Once more he crumbled the paper. Soon there was a small mountain of crumbled papers at his feet. He picked up a block of wood and tried to carve, but his knife would not do what he wanted it to do. He hurled the chunk of wood into the fireplace and sat staring into the flames.
Oh, he needs some inspiration, huh?
He does. When he heard the church bells announcing the midnight Christmas service, he got up. Slowly, he opened the drawer beneath the cupboard.
Uh-oh.
The drawer he had told the widow never to open. From it he took cloth embroidered with lilies of the valley and daisies. He took out a rough woolen shawl and a lace handkerchief. He took out a tiny white baby blanket and a little pair of blue socks. He placed each gently on the floor. From the bottom of the drawer he lifted out a picture frame, beautifully carved of deep brown chestnut wood. In the frame was a charcoal sketch of a woman sitting in a rocking chair holding a baby. The baby's arms were reaching up, touching the woman's face. The woman was looking down at the baby, smiling. Jonathan sat down in his rocking chair and held the picture against his chest. He rocked slowly, his eyes closed, 2 tears trailing into his beard. When he finally took the picture to his workbench, he began to carve. His fingers worked quickly and surely. He carved all through the night.
That was his inspiration.
That was his inspiration, wasn't it? The next day, there was a knock on the widow McDowell's door. When she opened it, there stood the woodcarver, his neck wrapped in a red scarf, holding a wooden box stuffed with straw. Mr. Toomey, said the widow, what a surprise! Merry Christmas!
Merry Christmas.
The figures are ready, he said as he stepped inside. From the box, Jonathan unpacked 2 curly sheep. happy sheep because they were with Jesus. He unpacked a proud cow and an angel, a very important angel, with mighty wings stretching from its shoulders right down to the hem of its gown. He unpacked 3 wise men wearing their most wonderful robes, edged with fur and falling in rich folds. He unpacked a serious and caring Joseph. He unpacked Mary, wearing a rough woolen shawl, looking down, loving her precious baby Jesus. Jesus was smiling and reaching up to touch his mother's face.
That's so nice.
Yeah. That day, Jonathan went to the Christmas service with Widow McDowell and Thomas. And that day in the churchyard, the village children saw Jonathan throw back his head, showing his eyes as clear blue as the August sky, and laugh. No one ever called him Mr. Gloomy again.
Mr. Gloomy wasn't gloomy anymore.
Oh. So do you remember why Jonathon Toomey was gloomy?
I think because his wife and baby had died a while ago, and that made him very sad.
Very sad. And that does make people very
Yes,
sad.
it does.
Yeah. But what he needed was somebody to care about him.
Yes.
And the widow McDowell and Thomas did.
They did, and they gave him a scarf, and they spent time with him, and the inspiration from that picture, that really changed him. Plus Jesus, of course, probably changed him, the story.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And when we meet people that are grouchy or gloomy, we can remember too that something has happened in their life that soured them, and we can pray for them and befriend them.
Yes, we can. That's a great story, Byron. Thank you so much for reading it to me.
You are welcome. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.